Hello, welcome. I'm Susanna Simmons, the Software Adoption Doctor, and this is our Consultant Specialist session with the lovely Mary Gregory. Mary Gregory is a sought-after international leadership consultant, and she has led change for organisations including First Choice Holidays, O2, Ralph Lauren, and Tesco. And she's a trusted coach to senior executives. She also designs and delivers large-scale leadership programs. Welcome, Mary. Great to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, in addition to all of that fantastic information in your bio, you're also the author of a book called Ego, aren't you? Which you can see in the background in
I
your.
happen to have a copy here just by sheer chance. Yeah. Yes,
And,
it
and
is
I've,
my
I've
book.
read it and it's fantastic. And that's what we're here to talk about today, ego in relation to software adoption, software companies. So before we delve into that, what I'd love to hear from you is your definition of ego. So what do we mean when we're talking about ego?
Yeah. So for me, ego gets, in the press, it gets talked about in the press and the media, and people talk about, he or she's got a really big ego. Oh, they're so overinflated. And they're always talking about somebody as being big headed with regards to ego. It is so much more than just that. And for me, ego is actually our psychological defense mechanism. So it's almost like we have this defense system that at the first sign of any social anxiety, so it's when we experience fear, even on a small level, it almost triggers our defense system to come into place, and that's when our ego will start acting for us, as it were. And I say acting for us, it almost is like we go onto automatic pilot because it's like a reaction that we have because that's how we've learned to survive in it, and we've learned these ways of being from when we're very young children because of circumstances that we've had to deal with in whatever shape or form.
Yeah.
And it can be not just overinflated, but also underinflated. So absolutely, bigging yourself up because you feel anxious. I can remember once, this is as a young executive, wanting to be the person that got noticed and trying to big myself up in the meeting to be noticed. There absolutely is that element of overinflated. But there's also that small voice in your head which is saying, oh, I'm not good enough. I'm just going to take myself backwards, because it is a defense mechanism. So if we feel nervous or anxious, or someone challenges us and we're like, oh, I don't know I can rise to that challenge, our ego might well kick in and will withdraw. So it can be underinflated, our ego, as
Yeah.
well.
And so what I'm hearing from you there is that we tend to be, I suppose, quite negative about ego, but actually it's very important because, like you say, it's a defense mechanism. It's there trying to keep us safe,
Yes.
but doesn't necessarily get the response that we necessarily want from others and so on, because it's almost that, is it more the emotional piece rather than the rational piece, so it automatically kicks in.
Yes, it is. It's our emotional reactions which cause our survival. Ego is a whole network system of survival strategies that absolutely are designed to keep us feeling safe. Might not necessarily keep us safe, but it keeps us feeling safe because we're experiencing that social anxiety. So yes, that's exactly what it is.
Um, and so, how can software companies, when they're thinking about onboarding customers, so they're onboarding programs and thinking about software adoption, where does ego come into play with this? Why is it worth them thinking about ego?
Well, the first reason is we've all got one. It's very,
That's
it's
very true.
hard to be a human being without having an ego. And if you're saying, "Oh, I haven't got an ego," then I'd be a bit worried that you weren't necessarily in touch with who you are. And we all definitely have reactions and get triggered. And whenever we're triggered, that is our ego coming into play. And software adoption, like any change, is going to evoke anxiety for people. So wherever, I recently had to do a download. I've got an Apple computer and had to do the latest iOS download update. And even that, I was feeling anxious about it, thinking, what if it mucks my computer up? What if this happens? Because we go into that what if scenario, which is absolutely our ego kicking in and being anxious about what could potentially happen. And therefore, took me some time to actually say, all right, I will do the update now. I better do it because I'm going to get it's good. Because the what if was becoming, if I leave it so long, I'll not ever be able to get it downloaded. So, eventually I did act on it, but it caused me to delay downloading that. Well, you put that on a much grander scale. So, for example, a whole organization or a whole, you think about a corporation that's got several, maybe hundreds of outlets and offices all around the world adopting that. You multiply that, and when people's fear kicks in, so does their resistance. So as a software developer, you've got to think about, how do I engage with the end user so this is not a terrifying experience for them? And it doesn't need to be terrifying. It can just be a little bit anxiety provoking, and people potentially could resist.
Yeah, and like you said, we've all got an ego, but also we're all different, aren't we? So there's an element of understanding that those reactions and those egos will respond maybe slightly differently, and being able to sort of take that step back and think about that and the different ways that it might impact different people.
Yes, absolutely. And what you're making me think of actually is thinking about different generations as well. So, the younger generations coming through are, technology natives. They've grown up with a lot of the modern technology. People of my generation, and not as old as me either, haven't. That we're more like the migrants, we're the technology migrants, so it takes us much longer to adopt. But you look at organizations, and there are many leaders in, say, Generation X, who are sort of like 40 plus generations, who still are needing to learn how all this technology works. They haven't necessarily grown up with it the way the younger generations, Generation Y coming through, and the millennials are much more natural in how they use technology. So maybe it'll get easier for software companies as younger generations come through. But having said that, any change has the potential to evoke anxiety for people, and therefore it's important to understand what some of those reactions might be.
Mm-hmm. And so, we've talked about resistance to change. How, in your experience, might ego impact the success of software adoption? Are there examples that you've seen in your career where ego is to play?
Yeah, so certainly in terms of demonstrating resistance, I can think of an organisation I worked with where they wanted to, they had a centralised function, and they wanted to integrate it into all the departments around the organisation. And this was a big organisation. And absolutely there was some huge resistance. Not only that, they were inviting the people who were, and maybe this is part of the challenge, was the strategy of the organization was to invite the people who originally had held this process to educate those around the organization to be able to take it on. So that almost like double anxiety for them, because not only were they having to learn this new software and how it would help free the whole organization up, but they were almost de-skilling themselves by doing so, because they were sharing their own wisdom, and they were going to have to find new roles within the organization that would be different to the ones they'd had. And it wasn't until I came in that the organization hadn't even thought through how they were going to engage these people in being part of the team that delivered this change. And then also, how were they going to engage people within the organization to take it on? Because some of the people in the organization were saying, well, just a minute, this function used to do that. Why should I take on another job which really isn't much? So the whole job, human beings can be incredibly, when they get into their ways of thinking, they kind of get into their furrow. Or I say I'm class myself in this. We get into our comfort zone, and this is how we do things around here. Why do I suddenly have to start accounting for this process as well when it used to be held by this particular department? So you've really got to think about, how do you engage people? How do you think about what's in it for me? People will engage more likely when they know what the benefits are for them, but that you also offer reassurance about what it's going to do for them, but also the journey that it's going to take to get there, and what support they might need along the way as well.
Yeah, because as humans, we don't like uncertainty, do we? So that communication piece and that setting expectations is really important, isn't it? Rather than surprising people with change.
I'd say it's difficult to generalize because I know some human beings who love uncertainty and
True,
thrive on
yes.
it, who really thrive on the excitement of it, and oh, we don't know what's around the corner, all that sort of stuff. But there are lots of human beings who prefer, particularly in corporate jobs, who are employed, have a preference for certainty. And so it's really worth thinking about, how do we engage with those people? How do we consult to make sure that people don't receive any surprises? So, I mean, I've worked with organisations where the way people found out was through the grapevine. Senior leaders never ever got to tell the message because they already knew about it by the time they were told of the message, which often happens in large organisations. So you've got to really think very carefully about the whole communication piece, about how you make sure people are kept up to date, how you provide dialogue, ongoing dialogue with people. So I can think of one organisation who did it well, actually, where they set up they actually had a sort of a hub, a centre where you could come. It was virtual and it was in reality. You could actually physically come to that part of there was a room set aside within a building that had the whole change thing mapped out, where you could come, and if you had any concerns or anxieties, you could talk to somebody who knew about it and who would listen in confidence to what you had to say. And that was run virtually as well as in person, and it was there set 5 days a week for people in terms of access to it. That worked really, really well, and that's something for software developers to take on, is how are we going to communicate and how are we going to support as we go through this change.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that comes out for me is that whilst I think some software companies might think, well, that's my customer's job, that they need to sort out their communications and so on. My belief is that actually the software companies have a role to play in that. They're the leaders of change.
Yes.
And they can help and advise their clients on how to do a good job and what's worked well in their experience, and they can bring this knowledge and experience, really show off their expertise.
Yes.
To make their customers successful. And for me, that's a win-win in terms of customer loyalty and so on, because they'll get such a good customer experience through that.
It's a fantastic opportunity for software companies, actually, because part of their job is to be consultants to their clients in order to deliver the best software for them. But part of understanding the whole change element of it is that it's multifaceted. It's not just, here, buy my software, implement it. It's like, let's create the software that's going to work best for you, but let's also talk about how we implement it in a way that people will engage with.
Yeah, definitely.
It's no good spending a fortune on a piece of software and people aren't going to use it.
No, exactly. And I want to circle back a little bit, because we talked a little bit about fear in terms of technology.
Yes.
And I think that's probably one of the ones for people to understand more easily. But I was thinking about, so obviously you've got the users, and some of those might be a bit fearful of technology, or there might be other things like you mentioned about sort of the changes in their job roles as well. But then some of the senior leaders and the stakeholders, there might be some stuff around status and things. So are there almost sort of categories of different areas that people might feel fearful about, so like status or particular drivers or anything like that?
Well, I think starting with drivers is useful, because people do have different drivers and they have different things that potentially trigger them. So for some people, not all, for some people status is important to them, and they feel rewarded when they're given status. So for example, job title is a form of status. Or getting a flash company car is another type of status. And if that's potentially threatened, that again will cause them to resist. So it might trigger in terms of if the status isn't acknowledged. So for example, if you've got the leader of the organisation and you haven't consulted with them, or you haven't consulted with the key stakeholders who are probably more senior leaders, you are at risk of triggering them into resisting because you're not paying attention to their status. Having said that, not everyone is status driven. Other people, it's much more about relationship. So being able to build that relationship, making sure that there's an element of getting to know you and finding out about your needs. others it's about fairness, that they're treated equally and people are treated equally. For others it's about having autonomy, so having a say in what they do. So feeling like they have some sense of control over the change that's happening. Well, if you know that people are motivated and driven by that, then that's going to influence your conversation with them to make sure they feel like they have a say and they have a choice in the change that's happening. And then there are other people, as we've talked about already, who are motivated or triggered, if it's missing, by certainty. And that will evoke those fears. So it's like finding out what are the drivers for different people and different groups of people as well. And you may have an organisation where so I can think of an organisation I work with where certainty is a massive driver. And you've got people who've worked in that organisation for many, many years, and that organisation has done lots of change in that time. But those people still like the certainty and the security that brings them. And then there are other organisations I can think of I've worked with where autonomy is really important. So if you take that away from them, that sense that they have some say and some sense of control, that is absolutely going to cause you problems in the implementation of your project. So bearing all those different elements in mind is really important. And part of the process for you as a software development company is to find out what are the things that motivate people in this organisation, what does drive them, what would cause them to be upset, what would cause them to dig their heels in and say, no, I'm not joining in that.
Yeah, and that's why, as you know, I've got the 7 pillars, and right up at the start there's that understand and manage those stakeholders.
Yes.
You obviously need the senior leadership level to be on board, because if they're not on board, then they'll help the rest of their department and their area of the business sort of block, no matter how much the people at the user level might be interested. If there's a senior leader that's resistant, that's going to be a major block, isn't it? But then, like you say, you've got the culture of the organisation, haven't you? And then you've got potentially some sort of subcultures within that as well. I know that the organisation that I work with, a really strong value for them, and actually isn't necessarily a cultural thing, but my experience is they tend to recruit people that have this, is that whole fairness. And so if they try and implement a change that is deemed to be unfair, then they do come up against a bit of resistance around it.
And that's part of the culture of the organisation. So they will keep recruiting people that match with their values. That's part of how the organisation and the culture perpetuates, really.
And I suppose another thing to consider in all of this is that, like you said, we've all got an ego, and we've been talking about the software company's customers and the egos within that, but then the software company itself is going to have egos within it, and it's understanding those as well, and actually how your own organization can create resistance and challenge in that process.
Yes, there is, and so there's something there about. I mean, what you're making me think about is that, if you're a software company and you're trying to sell your product to your customers, of course you're going to believe in it. Of course, for you, it's the best possible product. And that's where ego is positive. We kind of have to believe in it. So it's the thing about ego is it is a paradox in that respect. It is positive, and there are some downfalls for it. So it's working with the positives of it, that you do believe in your product, you do know that you've got something to offer, but then it's having that flexibility to shift if you need to, and to be there and understand where your customers are coming from, and not allowing I think particularly in a sales position, you can sometimes get evangelical about your product, and there are times you've got to really sometimes park that in order to really listen to where your customer is coming from. And that's where your ego might not be so helpful, in that it's getting in the way of you being able to listen and be really present with what your customers' requirements are.
And actually, that's reminded me of that classic divide that you get in software companies of sales and customer support, and it not necessarily being the case, but the perception being that sales have sold the customer the moon on a stick. And the technical side of the business is what goes into that threat space, and there really goes a challenge, because they're like, well, how on earth are we going to be able to deliver that in the time frame that you've promised? And so then you've got that that divide internally, and you're trying to present a united front to the customer, where actually behind the scenes everybody's sort of at war with each other, maybe slightly extreme, but it's it's that kind of trying to keep everybody on the journey together, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. And that's why leadership plays such a big part. So, in terms of the leaders within the organisation working together, working out a strategy where everyone can pull together, and that, sales are not making outlandish promises that operations can't deliver on, for example, or it's very hard for operations to deliver on. So, yeah, for sure.
So we've talked about software companies and their role as leaders of change. So have you got some tips about what they can be doing to help their customer be more successful? And you've already touched on one, and that came out very much in the book for me as well, is around listening. But feel free to expand on that, or are there others that you would?
Well, I'll expand on listening, but it leads us into the other, which is about being present. So I think one of the biggest underestimated skills of leadership, well, actually there's three that come up for me. One is listening, the other is being present, and actually when I talk about really effective listening, you cannot listen really effectively unless you are present. So often we're up in our own heads with our own agenda, thinking about, how can I get this one out, or what do I need here, and as soon as we're doing that, we're not really listening. So that's why being just present in the moment is so valuable. And then the third one is what I would call empathy, or compassion. So, the whole ability to put yourself into somebody else's shoes. And particularly if you're developing a piece of software for your customer and making it bespoke, it's impossible to do that unless you're able to really look and experience the customer's position. So getting yourself into their shoes, truly understanding things from their point of view, that's the gold. That's where the gold nuggets are in terms of developing something that's going to really delight your customers as well, and also that they'll engage with.
So if you use those three skills and use those with all of the stakeholders, that's really kind of a really good grounding, isn't it, for success?
Yes.
Because you're listening, that you're being present, and you're empathizing with each stakeholder's situation, and hearing what they need and what's going to be a challenge for them, and then being able to use all of that information and make informed decisions about the right things to do next, and how to configure the software, and how to roll it out, and those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a fourth one I've thought of as you summed that up, which is really these are things that I talk about in my workshops and when I'm coaching people, is coming from that place of curiosity as well. Yes. So in understanding where somebody's coming from, understanding what your customers' requirements are, what their experience are, it can be very easy. Again, this is a human being ego type response. It can be very easy to judge and, they just haven't got it, have they? They haven't thought it through properly because they're not understanding why X, Y, Z leads to B or whatever. Actually, just getting curious rather than judging at that moment. So that's interesting. I wonder why they're looking at it from that point of view rather than saying, well, they're just not savvy enough. That's why they're looking at it from that point of view. Just be curious about what's happening. And again, that's the way to innovate. By being curious, you can open up all sorts of possibilities with your customers and with your team in terms of what solution do we find here.
And that use of curiosity really helps with avoiding assumptions and bias as well, doesn't it? And that's really important. And it's hard though, isn't it, when you're in the thick of it, and there's lots going on, particularly if you're sort of in a firefighting situation, I suppose because the immediate reaction is the emotional one, you really have to stop yourself, don't you, and go, oh, yep, I'm judging the situation. I'm getting frustrated because I've got this going on over here, and then that's being thrown at me over there. And oh goodness, why can't they just get it or get on with it or whatever it might be? Where I actually have to stop and go, no, hang on a minute. You know, what are the circumstances around this situation? What's the context?
Yes, yes.
Just because company X over here has whizzed through and it's all been plain sailing, there'll be something different, because in the same way as humans are different, all organizations are different, aren't
Yes,
they?
they
So
are indeed. And what you're reminding me of is that whole thing about to get yourself grounded, get yourself present, because when you're present you can deal with whatever's going on around you, because everything happens in the moment. It doesn't happen back then, it doesn't happen in the future, it happens right now. And actually, if you're feeling under pressure, or you're feeling triggered, which is when your ego's starting to kick in, and again, self-awareness is so important here. Keep working on that self-awareness muscle, so you notice, oh my god, I'm getting a reaction here, or I'm feeling annoyed, or I'm feeling irritated, or feeling frightened, take a breath, breathe, just breathe and get yourself into neutral body language, and that will help you deal with your reaction. And what I would say, and comes from neuroscience actually, that if the red mist does descend, which it does, don't make any dramatic decisions at that point. Just let it descend and let it lift again. It will lift eventually. But when the red mist has descended, there's something about take some time out.
yeah,
Get yourself recentered, refocus, breathe, and then re-enter into whatever you're doing at that time. And if it's a conversation you're having with somebody, just pause the conversation. Take some time, go do whatever you need to calm yourself down, and then bring yourself back to it.
yeah, I think that's a really good piece of advice. And actually, you've got that as an individual, haven't you? And that's helpful within the software companies and the employees within there and in their roles, but then also them having the confidence to do that with their customers, to say they're in
Yes.
a meeting with a customer and they've got stakeholders around a table or around a virtual meeting on a screen, and if they can feel that those egos are coming to the fore and that the tensions are lifting, and to have those tools and techniques to be able to sort of either take a break or to switch the activity, to change the energy around, so maybe, or I know, to maybe to take things off, like whatever it might be, but having the confidence to step in really and say, okay, but I see what's happening here, my observation is, let's see what we can do to move this forward, because actually again that really increases their credibility, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So being able to facilitate, it takes a lot of skill to do that, but being able to facilitate those sorts of conversations is very powerful.
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in quite a short space of time. I've really enjoyed talking about ego. As I said before, I love your book, so I will put a link to that in the details with the video. So if anybody wants to check that out, they can get that. And obviously your contact details will be available as well, so people can get in touch with you to find out more about what you do. Thank you so much, Mary. And
absolute pleasure, Susanna. A real pleasure. Thank you.